Have you ever judged someone so harshly that the memory of it haunts you years later? Have you ever looked at another human being and decided, in that split second, that they were beneath you, unworthy of your respect, deserving of your mockery? I have. And the shame of what I did in 2019 still burns through my chest like acid every single time I remember it. Let me tell you about the ragged boy I mocked. The boy whose appearance I ridiculed without knowing anything about his story, his struggles, his heart. And let me tell you about the moment, years later, when I accidentally saw his bank account, when I discovered the truth about who he really was, and when the full weight of my cruelty came crashing down on me like a building collapsing. This is my confession, my burden, and perhaps my only chance at redemption through honesty. I was 23 years old in 2019, fresh out of college, armed with a business degree and an ego the size of a skyscraper. I had landed a decent job at a marketing firm in the city, was making good money, wore designer clothes that I really couldn't afford but bought anyway, because image was everything to me. My entire identity was wrapped up in appearances, in projecting success, in making sure everyone around me knew that I had made it. I drove a leased BMW that drained half my paycheck. I lived in an expensive apartment that left me eating ramen 3 weeks out of the month. But none of that mattered because when people looked at me, they saw success. They saw someone who had their life together. They saw someone important, or at least that's what I desperately needed them to see. Because deep down, beneath all that expensive fabric and false confidence, I was terrified of being seen as ordinary, as average, as someone who didn't matter. My worth, in my twisted understanding of the world, was entirely tied to how I looked and what I owned. And because I judged myself so harshly based on these superficial standards, I judged everyone else the same way. It was a cold November afternoon when I first saw him. I was walking down Market Street, heading to my favorite overpriced coffee shop where I'd spend $8 on a latte just to be seen there, just to sit in the window with my laptop and look important. The wind was cutting through the street, and I had my coat collar turned up, my leather gloves on, my scarf arranged just so. I was scrolling through my phone, probably checking my Instagram likes or posting some carefully curated story about my supposedly glamorous life, when I almost walked right into him. He was standing on the corner, and the first thing I noticed, the thing that made me stop and stare, was how absolutely ragged he looked. His clothes were torn and dirty, hanging off his thin frame like they belonged to someone twice his size. His pants had holes in the knees, and I could see his skin through the tears, red and raw from the cold. His jacket, if you could even call it that, was so worn that the fabric had gone shiny in places, threadbare and useless against the November chill. His shoes were falling apart, held together with what looked like duct tape, and his hair was long and unkempt, falling into his eyes. He couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, just a kid really, but he looked like he'd lived 100 hard years. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and there was a desperate, hungry look about him that should have sparked compassion in me, that should have awakened some basic human empathy, but it didn't. Instead, I felt disgust. I felt superiority. I felt that toxic mixture of pity and contempt that allows people to dehumanize others, to turn away from suffering, to convince themselves that poverty is somehow a personal failing rather than a circumstance. He was holding a sign, and I remember the words even now, burned into my memory like a brand. It said, "Hungry and homeless. Anything helps. God bless." His hands were shaking as he held it. Whether from cold or fear or desperation, I don't know. He wasn't aggressive or pushy like some people I'd encountered. He wasn't calling out to passers-by or making a scene. He was just standing there quietly, hopefully, waiting for someone to see him as human, to acknowledge his existence, to help. And what did I do? What did I in my expensive coat and my designer boots and my carefully constructed image of success do when faced with another human being in need? I laughed. Not a kind laugh. Not a nervous laugh, but a cruel, mocking laugh. I pulled out my phone and I took a picture of him. I actually took a picture of another person's suffering like it was entertainment, like his pain was content for my amusement. And then, because apparently that wasn't enough cruelty for one day, I posted it to my private Instagram story with the caption, "LOL, the things you see in the city. Get a job maybe?" I added laughing emojis. Multiple laughing emojis. I made his poverty, his hunger, his homelessness into a joke for my friends to laugh at. I turned his humanity into content. I reduced his entire existence to a punchline. And my friends, my circle of equally shallow, equally materialistic friends, they ate it up. The likes poured in. The laughing reactions flooded my notifications. People commented things like, "Seriously," and "He's probably making more than us, lol," and "These people are everywhere, so annoying." We had created this echo chamber of cruelty, this space where it was not only acceptable but encouraged to mock those less fortunate, to punch down, to feel superior at someone else's expense. And I felt validated. I felt seen. I felt like I had contributed something clever to the world. The shame I feel now remembering this is almost unbearable. How could I have been so heartless? How could I have looked at another human being in such obvious distress and chosen mockery over compassion? How could I have been so blinded by my own insecurities, my own desperate need to feel superior, that I couldn't see the person in front of me, the real person with real struggles and real pain? But in that moment, surrounded by the insulation of my privilege, protected by the shield of my carefully constructed identity, I didn't think twice about it. I walked past him without giving him a single dollar, without offering a single kind word, without acknowledging that he was a person deserving of dignity and respect. I walked into my expensive coffee shop, ordered my expensive latte, sat in my usual spot by the window and forgot about him. Or at least I tried to forget. But something about that encounter stuck with me, like a splinter working its way deeper under my skin. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking about him at odd moments. I'd be lying in my comfortable bed, and suddenly I'd see his face, those hollow eyes, that desperate expression. I'd be complaining about some trivial inconvenience, like the restaurant getting my order wrong or the traffic being bad, and I'd hear an echo in my mind asking what right I had to complain about anything when there were people sleeping on cold streets, wondering where their next meal would come from. But I pushed those thoughts away. I told myself I was being too sensitive, too emotional. I told myself that it wasn't my responsibility to save everyone, that I had my own problems, that I worked hard for what I had, and people needed to take responsibility for their own lives. I built walls of justification around my cruelty, brick by brick, until I'd constructed a fortress of denial that let me sleep at night. I convinced myself that I was a good person who had simply made one small mistake, one tiny moment of poor judgment, rather than facing the truth that my actions had revealed something fundamentally broken in my character, something rotten at my core. The weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years. Life went on. I got promoted at work. I moved to a bigger apartment. I upgraded my car lease. On the outside, everything looked perfect, like I was living the dream, climbing the ladder of success one expensive purchase at a time. But on the inside, something had shifted. That encounter with the ragged boy had planted a seed of doubt in my mind, a nagging question about who I really was, about what kind of person I wanted to be. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. The homeless woman who slept in the doorway near my office, the man who dug through trash cans looking for recyclables, the families huddled in shelters, the children whose eyes held the same hollow desperation I'd seen in that boy's face. And each time I saw them, I heard a voice in my head asking why I'd been so cruel, so heartless, so quick to judge and mock rather than help. But acknowledging that voice would mean admitting that I'd been wrong, that I'd been terrible, that I'd caused harm. And my ego, that enormous, fragile ego that I'd spent years carefully maintaining, couldn't handle that truth. So I buried it deeper, worked harder, bought more things, posted more carefully curated content, and kept running from the person I was becoming, from the person I already was. Have you ever been through something similar where you treated someone poorly and it haunted you later? Comment below and share your story. I need to know I'm not alone in this. Then came 2023, 4 years after that November day, 4 years after I'd mocked that ragged boy and tried to forget about him. I was working at a different company now, a bigger marketing agency with international clients and even more pressure to maintain appearances. I'd climbed higher up the corporate ladder, was making more money, living in an even nicer apartment, driving a car I actually owned this time. On paper, I was more successful than ever, but something had changed in me over those 4 years. Something subtle but significant. The seed of doubt that had been planted that day had slowly grown into something I could no longer ignore. I'd started volunteering at a food bank on weekends, not out of any genuine altruism at first, if I'm being completely honest, but because it looked good on my social media and made me feel like less of a terrible person. But somewhere along the way, Actually being around people who were struggling, hearing their stories, seeing their humanity up close, rather than from the comfortable distance of judgment, had started to crack the armor I'd built around my heart. I'd met a single mother working 3 jobs who still couldn't afford rent. I'd talked to a veteran with PTSD who couldn't hold down employment because his trauma was so severe. I'd served meals to families who were one medical emergency away from losing everything. And slowly, painfully slowly, I'd started to understand that poverty wasn't a personal failing, that homelessness wasn't a choice, that the world was far more complicated and far less fair than my privileged upbringing had led me to believe. But I still hadn't fully confronted what I'd done in 2019. I still hadn't looked directly at that memory and acknowledged the full weight of my cruelty. That reckoning came on an ordinary Tuesday in March, in the most unexpected way possible. I was at the office sitting in a conference room with my team, working on a pitch for a potential new client. We were waiting for our creative director to join us, and while we waited, one of my colleagues, Sarah, was scrolling through her phone laughing at something. She turned to the group and said, "You guys have to see this. Remember that entrepreneur who made headlines last year for his tech startup? The one who sold it for like $50 million? He just posted this incredible story about his background, about being homeless when he was younger. It's going viral." My ears perked up at the word homeless, probably because of my volunteer work, probably because I'd become more aware of these stories. Sarah passed her phone around the table, and when it got to me, I looked at the screen expecting to see some feel-good story about redemption and perseverance. And I did see that, but I saw something else too, something that made my blood run cold and my heart stop. The face looking back at me from that phone screen was older now, healthier, clean-shaven and well-dressed in an expensive suit, but I recognized it immediately. Those eyes, even though they were no longer hollow, even though they now sparkled with confidence and success, were the same eyes I'd looked into on that November day in 2019, the same eyes I'd mocked, the same eyes I'd dismissed as worthless. It was him, the ragged boy, the homeless teenager I'd photographed and posted about with laughing emojis, the person whose suffering I'd turned into entertainment. And he wasn't just some random success story. He was Marcus Chen, the 24-year-old founder of a revolutionary app that had changed the game in sustainable food distribution, connecting restaurants with excess food to homeless shelters and food banks. He'd been featured in Forbes. He'd given a TED Talk. He'd donated millions to organizations fighting homelessness. And 4 years ago, when I'd seen him on that street corner, when I'd judged him as worthless and lazy and undeserving, he'd been 19 years old, homeless after aging out of foster care, working 3 different jobs while teaching himself to code in public libraries, sleeping in shelters when he could get a bed and on the streets when he couldn't, and using every spare moment to build the app that would eventually make him a multimillionaire. I sat there in that conference room, staring at his face on that screen, and I felt the entire world tilt sideways. My hands started shaking. My vision blurred. The voices of my colleagues faded into white noise as my mind raced through 1,000 thoughts at once. That was him. That success story. That inspiration. That person who had overcome impossible odds to achieve something remarkable. That was the same person I'd reduced to a joke. The same person I'd deemed unworthy of basic human dignity. And the worst part, the part that made me want to vomit right there in that conference room, was that I'd been so wrong about him. Not just wrong in a small way, but fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. I'd looked at him and seen failure when I should have seen resilience. I'd seen laziness when I should have seen determination. I'd seen worthlessness when I should have seen potential. My entire framework for judging people, my entire system of values built on appearances and material success, had been revealed as not just flawed, but completely backwards. Here was someone who'd had nothing, who'd been at rock bottom, who'd looked the part of every stereotype I'd been taught to believe about homeless people, and he'd been working harder than I'd ever worked in my entire privileged life. He'd been building something meaningful while I'd been buying things I couldn't afford to impress people I didn't even like. He'd been focused on making the world better while I'd been focused on making myself look better. The irony was almost too painful to bear. Sarah was still talking, reading excerpts from Marcus's post about his journey, and I forced myself to listen even though every word felt like a knife twisting in my gut. He talked about the cold nights sleeping on sidewalks, about the hunger that gnawed at his stomach while he wrote code, about the people who had helped him and the people who had treated him like he was invisible. He mentioned one particular memory, A day in November 2019 when he'd been standing on a street corner in the city, holding a sign, hoping for enough money to buy a meal, and someone had taken his picture and laughed at him. He didn't mention the Instagram post. He didn't know about that. But he talked about how that moment had hurt, how being mocked at his lowest point had made him feel less than human, how he'd cried that night in the shelter, wondering if he'd ever be seen as a person worthy of respect. And he talked about how he'd used that pain, that humiliation, as fuel to keep going, to prove to himself and to the world that his circumstances didn't define his worth, that he was more than what people saw on the surface. My throat closed up. Tears burned behind my eyes. I wanted to run out of that conference room, to disappear, to somehow undo what I'd done, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in my chair, trapped in the nightmare of my own making, forced to confront the full magnitude of my cruelty. That was me. I was the person who had laughed at him. I was the person who had made him cry. I was the person who had treated him as less than human at his most vulnerable moment. And I'd done it without a second thought, without considering that he might be a real person, with real feelings and a real story. I'd done it because I'd been so consumed with my own insecurities, so desperate to feel superior to someone, anyone, that I'd been willing to step on someone else to lift myself up. The meeting continued around me, but I couldn't focus on anything except the realization of what I'd done, the weight of it crushing down on me like a physical force. When the meeting finally ended, I stumbled back to my desk and pulled up Marcus Chen's profile on every platform I could find. I read every interview, watched every video, absorbed every detail of his story. I learned that he'd grown up in foster care, bouncing from home to home, never finding stability or a family who truly wanted him. I learned that he'd aged out of the system at 18 with literally nothing, no family support, no safety net, no college fund or apartment waiting for him. I learned that he'd been accepted to a prestigious university but had to turn it down because he couldn't afford it, couldn't even afford the application fees. I learned that he'd worked as a dishwasher, a janitor, a delivery driver, sometimes all three at the same time, just to survive while he taught himself programming through free online courses and library books. I learned that he'd slept in his car until it broke down and he couldn't afford to fix it, then slept in shelters and on the streets while still showing up to his jobs every day, while still working on his app every night, fueled by nothing but determination and the desperate hope that things could get better. I learned that the day I'd seen him, the day I'd mocked him, he'd been about to give up. He'd been standing on that corner holding that sign, not because he was lazy or looking for handouts, but because he'd spent his last dollar on groceries for an elderly woman at the shelter who was diabetic and hadn't eaten properly in days. He'd given away his own food money to help someone else, and then he'd stood on that street corner, hungry and cold and ashamed, hoping that someone would show him the same kindness he'd shown to others. And I'd laughed at him. I'd turned his moment of vulnerability and generosity into a joke. The shame was overwhelming, suffocating. I sat at my desk and I cried. I actually cried at my desk, in the middle of the workday, tears streaming down my face as I confronted the reality of who I'd been, what I'd done. My assistant asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, and I couldn't even answer her. What could I say? How could I explain that I was crying because I'd discovered that I was a terrible person, that I'd treated another human being with contempt and cruelty, that I'd mocked someone at their lowest point and now had to live with that knowledge? I pulled up my old Instagram account, the one I'd used in 2019, hoping against hope that I'd deleted that post, that it was gone, that it existed only in my memory, and not out there in the digital world forever. But of course it was still there. I'd made it a close friend story, so it had expired after 24 hours, but the memory of posting it, the comments from my friends laughing along with me, the validation I'd felt from their reactions, all of that was preserved in my mind with perfect clarity. I'd treated Marcus Chen's suffering as entertainment, and I'd gotten exactly what I wanted from it: attention, likes, a feeling of superiority. The cost had been his dignity, his humanity, his right to exist without being mocked for his circumstances. And I'd paid that cost without hesitation because it hadn't been my cost to pay. It had been his. The next few weeks were some of the darkest of my life. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus on work or anything else because all I could think about was what I'd done, about the person I'd been, about the harm I'd caused. I'd go through my days on autopilot, smiling when expected, performing my job duties, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, But inside I was screaming. I was drowning in guilt and shame and the terrible knowledge that I couldn't undo what I'd done, couldn't take back that moment, couldn't erase the pain I'd caused. I considered reaching out to Marcus, trying to apologize, but how do you apologize for something like that? How do you say sorry for treating someone as less than human? How do you ask for forgiveness when you don't deserve it, when no apology could possibly be adequate? I drafted 100 messages and deleted them all. I imagined 100 conversations where I confessed what I'd done and begged for his understanding, but they all rang hollow, self-serving, more about making myself feel better than about actually making amends. The truth was that there was no way to make this right. The harm was done. The cruelty had been inflicted, and even though Marcus had clearly moved past it, had used it as motivation rather than letting it destroy him, that didn't absolve me of responsibility. It didn't make what I'd done okay. It didn't erase the fact that I'd contributed to his suffering at a moment when he needed compassion, not contempt. I started spending more time at the food bank, throwing myself into volunteer work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I needed to do something, needed to feel like I was making some kind of positive difference, needed to try to balance the scales somehow, even though I knew that helping others now couldn't erase the harm I'd done in the past. I worked longer hours, took on more shifts, volunteered for the hardest tasks, and slowly, very slowly, I started to understand something fundamental about empathy and compassion that I'd never grasped before. Every person I met at that food bank had a story. Every person experiencing homelessness had a history, a context, a set of circumstances that had led them to where they were. Some had mental illness, some had addiction, some had been victims of abuse or violence, some had lost everything in medical emergencies or economic downturns. Some were working full-time jobs that didn't pay enough to afford housing. Some were veterans, some were families, some were children, and every single one of them deserved dignity. Every single one of them deserved to be seen as a complete human being, not reduced to their worst moment or their most difficult circumstances. The person I'd been in 2019, the person who could look at someone struggling and see only something to mock, that person had lacked this fundamental understanding. I'd bought into this toxic mythology that success was entirely merit-based, that poverty was a choice, that people experiencing homelessness were somehow morally deficient or lazy. I'd needed to believe that because it protected me from having to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality, about privilege, about the role that luck and circumstance play in everyone's life. If I could convince myself that people got what they deserved, then I didn't have to feel bad about my advantages or guilty about my indifference to others' suffering. I could tell myself that I'd earned everything I had through hard work alone, conveniently ignoring the family support, the educational opportunities, the safety net that had always been there to catch me if I fell. Marcus Chen hadn't had any of those things. He'd started with nothing and built something remarkable through sheer determination and intelligence and resilience. He was everything I'd pretended to be, everything I'd wanted people to think I was, but he'd actually earned it the hard way, and I'd looked at him at his lowest point and decided he was worthless. The cognitive dissonance between my perception and reality couldn't have been more extreme. As the months passed and I continued volunteering, continued learning, continued trying to become a better person, I kept following Marcus's journey from a distance. He launched new initiatives. He gave speeches about economic inequality and the importance of second chances. He donated to causes supporting foster youth and homeless individuals. He became an advocate for the people society had written off, using his platform and his resources to shine a light on issues that most successful people preferred to ignore. And every time I saw him doing this work, I felt a mixture of admiration and shame. Admiration because he was genuinely making the world better, using his success to lift others up rather than to build walls between himself and the people he'd come from. Shame because I knew that if our situations had been reversed, if I'd been the one to achieve that kind of success, I probably would have used it to distance myself from my past, to climb higher up the ladder of social status, to surround myself with luxury and comfort, and forget about the people still struggling below. I'd been given every advantage in life and had used those advantages to judge others. He'd been given nothing and had used his success to help others. The contrast couldn't have been clearer or more damning. One night, about 8 months after I'd discovered his identity, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I came across a new post from Marcus. He'd shared a photo of himself from 2019, A selfie taken in what looked like a shelter, his face gaunt and tired but determined. The caption read, "4 years ago today I was sleeping in a shelter, working 3 jobs, and coding my app on a laptop I'd bought from a pawn shop with my dishwashing money. I was exhausted, I was scared, I was hungry most days. But I believed that things could get better and I was willing to work for it." If you're struggling right now, if you feel like giving up, if the world has told you that you don't matter, or that you'll never amount to anything, I want you to know that you're wrong. Your circumstances don't define you. Your potential is unlimited. Keep going. I believe in you. I stared at that post for a long time, reading the caption over and over, looking at his face in that photo, seeing the same determination I should have seen that day on the street corner. And something broke open inside me, some final barrier I'd been maintaining between my old self and the person I was trying to become. I couldn't keep carrying this secret anymore, couldn't keep hiding from what I'd done, not because I deserved relief from the guilt, but because maybe, just maybe, sharing my story could prevent someone else from making the same mistake I'd made. Maybe my shame could serve a purpose beyond just punishing me. So let me tell you what I learned from mocking that ragged boy in 2019, from discovering who he really was, from living with the shame of my cruelty. I learned that appearances tell you nothing about a person's worth, nothing about their character, nothing about their potential. The person sleeping on the street could be working 3 jobs. The person holding a sign could be teaching themselves skills that will change the world. The person in ragged clothes could have more determination, more integrity, more genuine success in their future than you could ever imagine. I learned that judging others based on their circumstances is not just cruel, it's stupid. It's a failure of imagination, a failure of empathy, a failure of basic human decency. It reveals far more about the person doing the judging than it does about the person being judged. When I mocked Marcus Chen, I wasn't making a statement about him. I was revealing my own insecurities, my own shallow value system, my own desperate need to feel superior to someone because I felt so inadequate inside. I learned that privilege is invisible to those who have it until they're forced to see it. I'd spent my whole life thinking I'd earned everything through merit alone, never acknowledging the advantages that had smoothed my path. I'd had a family, I'd had a home, I'd had access to education, I'd had a safety net, I'd had opportunities that Marcus never had, and yet I'd looked at him and assumed he was failing where I was succeeding, when the truth was that he was overcoming obstacles I'd never had to face while I was coasting on advantages I'd never had to earn. I learned that empathy isn't just a nice quality to have. It's essential to being a decent human being. The ability to look at another person and imagine their experience, to consider their story before judging their situation, to extend the benefit of the doubt and basic kindness regardless of how they look or what they have. That's not optional. That's the bare minimum requirement for participating in a society, for being part of the human community. And I'd failed that minimum requirement spectacularly. I learned that social media, that digital space where we perform our lives and curate our images, can bring out the absolute worst in us, if we're not careful. It gave me the distance I needed to dehumanize Marcus, to turn him from a person into content, to seek validation for cruelty from people who were just as lost as I was. It created an echo chamber where mockery was encouraged and compassion was seen as weakness. And I bought into it completely because it fed my ego and my need for attention. I learned that you can't undo harm, but you can choose to be better going forward. I can't take back that moment on the street corner. I can't erase the pain I caused Marcus Chen. I can't retrieve that Instagram story or unsend those laughing emojis, but I can refuse to be that person anymore. I can work to dismantle the toxic beliefs that led to that cruelty. I can volunteer my time and resources to help people experiencing homelessness. I can speak up when I see others being mocked or dehumanized. I can use my privilege now to amplify voices that are often ignored, to support causes that matter, to try in some small way to put more kindness into the world than I took out of it with that one thoughtless, cruel act. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that the shame I carry from what I did is appropriate and necessary. I shouldn't let myself off the hook. I shouldn't minimize it or excuse it or find ways to make it okay in my mind. What I did was wrong, it caused harm, and I need to live with that knowledge. Not because I deserve to suffer, but because that discomfort, that shame, is what keeps me accountable. It's what prevents me from sliding back into my old patterns of judgment and superiority. It's what reminds me every day to be better, to do better, to see people as people rather than as opportunities for mockery or content or validation. Marcus Chen, wherever you are, whatever you're doing with your remarkable life and your well-deserved success, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for laughing at you. I'm sorry for taking your picture. I'm sorry for posting it with those horrible captions and emojis. I'm sorry for treating you as less than human at a moment when you deserved compassion and help. I'm sorry for being so blind, so cruel, so wrapped up in my own insecurities that I couldn't see the person right in front of me. You deserved better. You deserved kindness. And I failed you completely. I don't expect forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I don't think sharing my story somehow balances the scales or makes up for what I did. But I do hope that maybe, just maybe, someone reading this or listening to this will think twice before judging someone based on their appearance, before mocking someone for their circumstances, before treating another human being as less than worthy of dignity and respect. I hope that my shame can serve as a warning, a cautionary tale about the person you become when you let superficial values and insecurities guide your actions. I hope that you'll learn from my mistake without having to make it yourself, that you'll choose compassion over contempt, empathy over ego, kindness over cruelty. Because here's the thing I wish I'd understood back in 2019. Everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about. Everyone has a story that would break your heart if you took the time to hear it. Everyone deserves to be treated with basic human dignity, regardless of how they look, what they own, where they sleep, or what their bank account says. The ragged boy on the street corner might be the next Marcus Chen, might be working harder than you've ever worked, might be carrying burdens you couldn't imagine while still finding the strength to keep going, to keep hoping, to keep believing in a better future. Or they might not be. They might never achieve conventional success. They might struggle their whole lives. And you know what? That doesn't matter. Their worth as a human being isn't contingent on their future success, or their productivity, or their ability to overcome impossible odds. They deserve dignity and compassion simply because they exist, simply because they're human, simply because we're all in this together, and the only thing that makes life bearable is our ability to see each other, truly see each other, and extend whatever kindness we can. So I'm asking you, I'm begging you, learn from my mistake. Don't be the person I was in 2019. Don't let your insecurities turn you cruel. Don't let your privilege blind you to others' struggles. Don't reduce people to their appearances or their circumstances. Don't turn suffering into entertainment. Don't seek validation through mockery. Don't dehumanize others to make yourself feel superior. Be better than I was. Be the person who stops and helps. Be the person who sees humanity in everyone. Be the person who extends kindness without expectation of return. Be the person who understands that we're all connected, that your comfort and my comfort and everyone's comfort is built on our willingness to care for each other, to support each other, to recognize that there but for the grace of circumstance go all of us. I still think about Marcus Chen almost every day. I still carry the shame of what I did, and I still hope that somehow in some way I can spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of person who would never do something like that again, trying to put more good into the world than the harm I caused that November day. That's my story. That's my confession. That's my shame, laid bare for you to judge as you will. I hope it means something. I hope it changes something. I hope it makes you think before you judge, before you mock, before you dismiss someone as unworthy of your compassion. Because we all have the capacity for cruelty, but we also all have the capacity for kindness. And the choice between them, the decision about which person we want to be, that's something we make every single day, in every interaction, with every person we meet. Choose kindness. Choose empathy. Choose to see people. Please. Have you ever judged someone and later regretted it deeply? Have you ever had a moment that changed how you see people forever? I want to hear your stories, your reflections, your own moments of shame and growth. Share them in the comments below because we need to talk about these things. We need to acknowledge our failures and learn from them together. And if this story touched you, if it made you think or feel something, please leave a like to let me know. Subscribe to Through My Eyes for more honest, raw stories about the moments that change us, the mistakes that teach us, and the journey toward becoming better humans. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being willing to sit with the uncomfortable truth that we're all capable of both terrible cruelty and tremendous growth. Let's choose growth. Let's choose better. Together.